So, what factors drove 15th century European explorers? What was the motivation for their explorations, and what made their voyages possible? To start considering this question, you really have to look at the isolation of Europe at the beginning of this time period, particularly talking about global trade is concerned. Europe coming through sort of the collapse of the Roman Empire, the rebuilding into the Middle Age time period, had for the most part been fairly isolated from the main centers of commerce in the world, which was really um, sort of the corridor between the Middle East, China, with India in the middle, and the steppe lands stretching between them as well, including the east coast of Africa and through land trade routes into North Africa. Those were the locations that were sort of most vibrant and connected via these trade routes. And they had a lot of really cool things, essentially, that they were trading that Europeans sort of realized that were out there, primarily after the time period of the Crusades, and getting more contact with the wider world on a limited basis. Certain locations, such as Venice, Italy, for example, were able to create pretty powerful states trading with the Muslim kingdoms and empires, the emerging Ottoman Empire, for example, and were able to become quite profitable. But there was a sense that Europe was definitely on the very last end of this much larger trading world, and that they wanted to gain better and more access to these goods because, of course, if one king or one ruler was able to get these items, for example, spices were very, very sought after, incense, porcelain china, cloth, and so forth were all very, very highly prized. Spices, particularly because they were essentially could make food taste better, they could preserve food. It was seen as a status symbol, and that if they could gain access to these goods before anyone else, they could make a huge amount of profit. Of course, Europe was not one political state at this point in time. It was essentially broken up between a lot of rival competing kingdoms. So they was definitely wanted to compete with each other to gain access to these resources. If you look at the very first attempts to, for example, sail around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa by the Portuguese, the main intent was to try to tap into these trading networks. Now, there are a few things that made Europe successful during this time period that they had not been able to really push the boundaries of this exploration beforehand, and that was primarily technology that was now being made available in Europe, which had not been widely available before this time period, and that they had essentially received that technology from Muslim seafarers. That Genoa, Venice, other trading cities in Italy had been in contact and had sort of learned and traded for these various goods. So, for example, the compass is an example of technology that was developed in China, was eventually adopted by Muslim seafarers, and was then adopted by Europeans. Same thing with the astrolabe to help tell your latitude and longitude, developed by Arab seafarers, picked up by sort of the general broader Muslim world, and was then transferred to the Europeans as well. And these are really what's going to help them start navigating larger distances, as well as the invention of the caravel, the lateen sail to help tack into the wind. All these are going to make the expansion of seafaring possible. The end result of being able to tap into these trade networks, as the Portuguese are successful and able to do, is great profit. They come back, and even though they lose a number of ships in the process, the amount of trade goods that they're able to bring back with them makes them a great amount of profit, and really just going to set the stage for other explorers to try to accomplish the same thing. Now, when the Spanish eventually start funding Columbus and other expeditions into the Caribbean region, they realize fairly quickly that no, they have not actually reached Asia as Columbus was intending to do. They have instead essentially found a new location, but that there was some evidence that there could be some gold available. So once more, profit seems to be a huge motivating factor in these explorations, as very quickly they try to start exploiting the American Indian populations of these islands and eventually the mainland to try to find and accumulate as much of this sort of hard material wealth as they can. Of course, along the coast of Africa, they begin to trade with the African kingdoms along the coast for enslaved individuals, which they realize they can start using on plantations to get profit that way. But to one degree or another, most of these motivations are economic motivations, that they're very much coming down to these countries trying to expand their own wealth, and what they find and the methods that they use to accumulate wealth, while very unscrupulous, I would say, that's always their sort of main goal. A lot of people brought up the idea of religion as being a main factor, and I'm going to say you're not wrong in this, but I wouldn't say it's the primary factor. Of course, one of the reasons why Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to fund Columbus was to try to launch another crusade, which would have ended horribly because the Ottoman Empire was far stronger than Europe at this point in time. But regardless, that was their sort of motivation behind it. And certainly once they did establish sustained contact with the Americas, the religious aspect of it starts to gain, I would say, more importance than the very first wave of explorers who very much were devoted to trying to find things that they could profit off of. Once they did realize, though, there was this large population who are not Christians, the Catholic Church gets involved and starts trying to send more missionaries to try to convert them. And we'll see in the document exercise, while there is debate about how to treat the American Indians that they are engaging with, it seemed like for the most part, and particularly when the Catholic Church, after the Reformation time period, the Counter-Reformation, a big portion of that was to try to expand the Catholic influence by converting those peoples in the Americas. So certainly I would say that's a portion of it, but for the very earliest explorers, maybe not the first element. A lot of people also brought up this idea of sort of personal glory that the explorers wanted. I'd certainly say that's an element, but probably once more not as much as a financial gain that they were hoping to achieve. But if they were able to get some notoriety in the meantime, I would say they would figure all the better. At this point in time, especially for these early explorers, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in accumulating land or control over populations. The only reason they really wanted to have control over the American Indians, for example, was to try to get them to look for gold for them, was to look for things that would directly profit them. So I would say sort of control and expansion of land and territory only in the sense of it trying to lead to more immediate profits. So thinking about the importance of winds and currents, and the patterns that they form and how this sort of traditionally impacted world trade. Then for the second part of the question, looking at how crucial was an understanding of the world's wind patterns to the success of European overseas expansion. And really, for the first question, you have a long history of this in world trade, especially in the Indian Ocean. And this is one of the reasons why, at the beginning of our time period here, the Indian Ocean is really considered the center of world trade. You had people from China trading with Indonesia, trading with Southeast Asia, trading with India, peoples there trading with the Islamic Middle East, trading with the coast of East Africa, and all these various locations engaging in this international trading system. And the reason why this was able to become so widespread and so lucrative was thanks to the monsoon winds and currents, which were very, very steady and reliable in the Indian Ocean. The fact that at a certain time of year you could pretty much guarantee that winds were going to be blowing in one direction, and then they'd be blowing in another direction in another 6 months or so. So ultimately what this ends up meaning is that a lot of times voyagers in one location of the Indian Ocean would set out when they knew the winds were going to be at their back. They'd arrive at their destination, they'd trade, oftentimes they'd stick around for a number of months while they were waiting for the more favorable winds to come back, and then they would return back with their ships loaded up with trade goods from a new location. And this did a couple things. Obviously, it brought a lot of trade and commerce and contact between all of these cultures. Also, just the fact that there were so many people who were sort of on these layovers, if you want to think of them like that, staying in one location or another, meant that they were learning the language, meaning that they were, creating friends and alliances and business partners. And really, the Indian Ocean world was a very interconnected world, from the east coast of Africa all the way to China. With all of those locations and kingdoms and people really profiting and benefiting off of it. And the main reason that that was able to be created and sustained for such a long time was the reliability of travel. And that's really what those monsoon winds um, were very, very good for. The fact that there was that sort of reliable natural phenomenon you could count on in order to get where you wanted to go. So this meant a couple of big things. First of all, it meant that sea trade could be faster, safer, cheaper, and more wide-ranging than trade over land. Of course, the other real big trade network that we think of historically is the Silk Road, which was essentially a land trade route, which, with lots of different stops and people sort of doing different parts of the journey, stretched from China all the way to the Middle East. And of course, there were land trade routes that ran from the Middle East then into Europe, down into Africa, into West Africa, um, and so forth. So really, Eurasia was very much connected both by land and by sea in these large trade routes. But the Indian Ocean, the reliability of those winds, made the sea oftentimes a more attractive option for this long range trade because, as I mentioned, you could get there much faster than traveling via land. It might be, depending on what time you're talking about, what time period, it could be safer, seeing as how there could be a potential chance of bandits or people raiding your trade caravans. It could be cheaper, rather than having to hire a whole bunch of camels and guards and people to bring your goods from one location to another. You can just hire a ship with a crew. And also more wide-ranging. Oftentimes, the way that the land routes worked is that people would only go a relatively short distance along the Silk Road. So they just go to sort of the next hub over, trade their goods to another trader who would sort of bring it to the next hub, which meant that there were a lot of middlemen and the profits would get cut down quite a bit along the way. The importance and one of the benefits of sea travel is that it could cut out a lot of those middlemen because someone from China would have a much higher chance of being able to directly deal with someone, say, from India via a nautical trading route than with a land trading route. So all these were reasons why these sort of winds and current patterns helped world trade in general, and that's one of the reasons why the Europeans were so eager to try to tap into them. The Portuguese main mission was to try to get into that Indian Ocean trade network because they realized just how lucrative and how vibrant it was. Europeans, for their part, very much needed to sort of learn some of these lessons. They needed to build up sort of the practical knowledge of the winds and how to do this long distance sailing because, quite honestly, they hadn't really done it. There were some small local sailing and ship building and fishing and so forth in the Atlantic. Most of the longer distance and trading that Europe was doing previous to this time period was almost exclusively in the Mediterranean, which certainly takes a decent amount of knowledge and skill to navigate, but going out into the Atlantic Ocean is a whole different ballgame. Certainly, when it came to learning these lessons about the winds and the current patterns in the Indian Ocean, they had the advantage that essentially they had people to teach them. They could rely on people who had been involved in that trade network to essentially show them the ropes and let them know what time of years are the best times to sail and help them with that knowledge. Whereas in the Atlantic, they pretty much were left up to discovering their own devices, and this is one of the reasons why slowly over time between sort of the first voyages that Columbus makes, subsequent voyages by the Spanish, and eventually the French and the British, travel between Europe and the Americas becomes safer, becomes faster, and in the 200 years after the first contact period, there wasn't a huge increase in nautical and ship-making technology. A lot of the reasons why these improvements occurred was just the knowledge of the wind patterns and the sea patterns and how to sort of be safer and do more with what they had. A good method of this, and what the Portuguese sort of caught on to very early, was something that they called volta do mar, or return through the sea. Which was essentially trying to find a way to avoid hostile winds or winds that are blowing directly at you, because it's much more difficult to try to sail directly into the wind. It's a lot more time consuming. It's a lot more dangerous. So what essentially the Portuguese decided to do was, well, rather than trying to go from point A to point B in a straight line against winds that are set against us, we're going to go out of our way a little ways, circle around, catch a more favorable wind, which will, even though we might have to sail 200 or 300 miles out of our way, is actually going to be safer and is going to be quicker than trying to sail directly against an incoming wind. Um, and that's one of the ways that they were able to really become so successful early on in this process. And very quickly, other European explorers and traders and so forth are going to be picking up on this and emulating those. A perfect example of how this is eventually going to look is the example of the triangle trade. And we'll be talking more about that in a few weeks here. But essentially, the triangle trade, not only does it take advantage of the fact that there are sort of commodities that people are looking for in Africa and South America, in the British colonies in North America, and back into Europe, but it's also essentially taking advantage of those trade winds. The easiest way essentially to make that circular loop is to go from Europe down to Africa, over to the Caribbean, up the coast in North America, then catch a wind heading back towards Europe. So it just also not just sort of economically made sense, but made sense as far as how the wind and trade patterns were set up to work and to operate. So this next question was very topical. Our country is currently engaged in a debate about how we should view and remember Christopher Columbus. In light of what we have learned this week, how do you view Columbus? Do you think he should still be celebrated as a national hero with his own holiday and commemorative statues, or do you think we should reconsider and possibly remove such monuments? I really love the thought that a lot of you put into this question. It seemed like you really tried to look at all the information that was presented in the PowerPoint and the textbook, as well as sort of your own experiences as far as how you have learned this information beforehand, what has changed, what you learned this week. Or maybe what you already knew, and just sort of what you've brought into this question. A lot of you thought that, sort of given that Christopher Columbus was not the first to discover America, that, essentially American Indians, of course, were the first to discover America, and he's not the first European to discover America. That, of course, was Leif Erikson. That is somewhat being misinterpreted or represented oftentimes of Christopher Columbus. The fact that he sort of just got lost and happened to stumble upon the Americas somewhat sort of pokes holes in this idea of him being such a genius navigator. And a lot of people brought up the idea of the human rights abuses that occurred either directly by him or under his rule while he was the governor of those islands, which were detailed, but are some pretty horrific things. And particularly if you look at the sharp decrease and decline in the American Indian population during that time, due partially to disease, but also to some pretty horrific genocide. Certainly, those are all things that people brought up as far as why they believe that certainly Christopher Columbus deserves to be reconsidered in how we are taught and learn about him, and possibly how he is remembered as well. But also, a lot of people sought to sort of create a balance here, because certainly, while all those things are true, Columbus is still a historically significant figure. Though he wasn't the first to discover America, he was the first to essentially lead the expedition that established sustained contact, and that's sort of the key, right? Where a lot of the things that are going to be coming after this were only made possible by that sustained contact between European and the Americas. That the first expedition from Leif Erikson, that was never established. It was a small community that was abandoned fairly quickly. There was never a large go-between between the Americas and Eurasia. Certainly after Columbus's expedition, that does happen. Also, in order to launch this expedition, Christopher Columbus had to be fairly intelligent as far as how he went about funding it. And also he had to be fairly brave and have knowledge of seafaring to get as far as he did across the Atlantic Ocean. So people are really trying to find a way and think about how can we kind of create a balance between these two ideas, the historical significance versus the fact that maybe he certainly was not as great as a person as we've come to believe, and maybe did not accomplish all those things to the level that we were originally taught. And particularly when you start getting down to the idea of monuments and the celebration, the national holiday that we still have for him, a lot of people said that they would be okay with doing away with those, or certainly trying to recontextualize them in some way. There was a sense from a lot of people they don't want to erase history, and that somehow targeting monuments or Columbus Day would be just trying to erase history in general. Which is somewhat confusing to me because, I mean, monuments aren't history, and a national holiday isn't history. Certainly, I don't think anyone's arguing that Columbus shouldn't be taught in the classroom. He shouldn't be taught in college classes like this. I don't think anyone's really saying that he should be forgotten. And I think it sort of brings up the point of the purpose of a lot of these monuments and the holiday. The purpose of these monuments when they were created, and the purpose for which they were created, wasn't information. It wasn't to inform people that, hey, this guy exists and these are the realistic things he did. The purpose was for glorification, to say that this is a great individual that we should aspire to be like. And I think that's where a lot of the criticism does warrant some some idea of what we should do with these monuments and so forth. A lot of people brought up Howard Zinn's discussion on this and how he said, well, maybe you shouldn't take down the monuments, but there should be some way to at least use them to create a broader discussion. I had one person create the suggestion that maybe we should put up another statue next to the heroic looking one of him committing some sort of crime or doing something not so glorious, which I don't know if that's necessarily the way to go, but certainly I think one of the problems that a lot of people have with the monuments is that they do only tell that one side of history, right? That it's not a complete holistic side, and trying to struggle to find a way to present that and not just having these monuments there as a glorification. One more item that was brought up by a lot of people is this idea that we shouldn't judge Christopher Columbus by our modern perspective, that he was a person of his time, that it could have been any number of people from Europe who came to the Americas and they would have behaved in a similar way because sort of the ethics of medieval Europe were different than our own modern times. And I think that's sort of a dangerous and slippery slope to go down, particularly because what you're doing is essentially confirming that the only viewpoint that matters is the viewpoint of Europeans. Because that viewpoint, as much as you want to say that, well, it was just part of Christopher Columbus's culture and society and how he was raised to look down on people of different religion and people who were looked different than him, it certainly was not in the culture or the society of the Taino Indians to be tortured and mutilated and killed. They certainly would have been making a judgment about Christopher Columbus, and it would have been very different than the people in Europe would have been making. So when you say that we can't sort of judge him by a modern perspective, what you're really saying is you only want to judge him by one cultural perspective, the European cultural perspective in history, and not accounting for how he would have been viewed and interpreted by other cultures around the world, and particularly those who he would have been most impactful of. So just something to think about and consider. So looking at the list of food dishes that I asked you to create, looking at a combination of foods that came both from the Eastern and Western hemispheres, and really the point of this exercise was to sort of think about how much of the food we eat and enjoy today was only made possible by this exchange. First of all, just to make sure that we're all clear, because there seemed to be a little bit of confusion, the Columbian Exchange doesn't really actually refer to Christopher Columbus himself. Only insofar as he was sort of the first person to establish this sustained contact between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. It wasn't like Columbus himself was running around doing all this trading and exchanging. It primarily refers to the about 200-year time period after the sustained contact was established. That all of these various foods and peoples and diseases and everything was exchanged in this process of increasing contact between the people of Eurasia and the people of the Americas. But overall, I thought the class did a fantastic job of coming up with examples. Just to list a few of the great ideas he came up with, chocolate cake, cheeseburgers, guacamole, spaghetti, pizza, chocolate ice cream, pancakes of syrup, burritos, coffee, hash, turkey sandwiches, pumpkin pie, tomato soup, tacos. The list goes on, and even though it seemed like 20 dishes was going to be a lot, I have a feeling that you found it relatively more easy than you would think to come up with all the various ways that the food that we eat today has been impacted and influenced by this exchange. It's also important to note that not only is important because of sort of the variety that starts to be spread around the world. This exchange ultimately has some very important impacts on population levels. Um, at the time or shortly after the time period of the Columbian Exchange here, for example, you see population levels in Northern Europe being boosted by the introduction of the potato, that they were able to grow in larger quantities in climates that weren't great for growing certain other kind of plants, were very good and suitable for growing potatoes. And potatoes, if eaten in high enough quantity, you can pretty much just survive off of eating just potatoes. They are so sort of rich in nutrients. Might not be a very interesting way to survive, but it gets you a long ways towards those nutrition requirements simply eating potatoes. So the fact that they're introduced into Northern Europe and is suddenly this sort of superfood ultimately ends up boosting the population levels in places like Scotland, Ireland, Scandinavia. And you see a very similar thing happening with population levels in China. That's sort of by this time period, by the late 16th, early 17th century, most of the arable land in China had already been used up for agriculture. But the introduction of crops such as sweet potatoes and maize, which is sort of essentially corn, made that there was land that was not suitable for sort of the traditional millet and so forth that was being grown in China. Rice and millet started being their two main early staples, but by then supplementing those with sweet potatoes and this sort of maize, early version of corn, you see the population in China starting to spike after the introduction and trade with these plants. So very much at the time period has a large impact on population levels. And that's only going to increase as time goes on, because if you look at the modern world we live in today, the only way that we're able to sustain our modern population levels is through this exchange, really. If you look at where the majority of the world's food is grown and what that food is, for example, if you look at the majority of the grains and the wheat that are grown in the world, a lot of it's grown right here in the United States, which of course is in the New World. And if those none of those grains, whether it's wheat or barley or oats, none of that was native to the Americas. It all came from Eurasia. As well as if you think about all the large land animals that we eat and consume, all of those were also from Eurasia, grown in the United States, and is now shipped throughout the United States and also in certain cases throughout the world. And there's lots of other examples on a global scale as far as how this exchange is still, impacting the way that we eat, live, and survive today. So pretty hard to, I would say, overestimate the important impact that this had. Of course, looking on to our future question here, there are definitely some negatives that come along with the Columbian Exchange. But it is important to note just how impactful and important these exchanging of these plants and crops really were. All right, so moving on, we're really with this question trying to get at some of the sort of dark sides of the Columbian Exchange. So imagine a plague such as the Columbian Exchange diseases killing 90% of the population were to break out today. What would be the impact on our modern culture and society, and how do you think people would react? What can this tell us about the role of the Columbian Exchange diseases in history and their impacts on American Indians? So first of all, I give the class overall good credit for this question. I thought there were a lot of really good answers. Some students seem to sort of take this as a challenge to try to be clever and try to say, well, I'm just going to come up with a scenario where we avoid a disease that kills that many people. Like, that couldn't happen these days. We'd solve it with medicine and stuff like that. That's really not what the question was asking for. The question was asking if a disease did happen and there wasn't anything we could do about it, and it was killing up to 90% of the population, how would things look? Because I can guarantee you that if you would have gone back in time and talked to the American Indian populations prior to this outbreak, they probably too would have felt like, well, nothing like this could ever happen to us. Our own medicine could take care of it, or we would be protected by our ancestors or our gods. They also would have seemed, or would have, definitely said that something like this would have been incapable of happening. So I think it's sort of dangerous here, and from a modern perspective, to just say, well, we're so much more advanced now, nothing like this could ever happen, because I think it absolutely could. That's something that I think we have to certainly use the past to try to consider what some of the impacts might be, but also it's a good way to sort of think about how impactful this was to to the peoples of the past. So those people who did go on to sort of contemplate what would happen pretty much described the complete collapse of social, economic, and political systems. After a plague like this came through, there'd really be nothing left that would resemble, the world we live in today. No one would be going to work because there would be no jobs. We'd all have to find other ways to get food because the people who were growing our food would no longer be alive. Pretty much it's hard to imagine a political system surviving through something like this. So it really would be a very different world. If you want to think about it almost like The Walking Dead, minus the zombies, of course. That's that sort of desolate landscape, sort of vestiges of what had been around you, but certainly not able to survive nearly the same way that you did before. That's sort of the impact that this level of a disease could have. The recent COVID-19 pandemic, I think, is a perfect example. And even though this was a much less virulent disease than those which were reflecting and impacting the American Indians, we can see what a profound impact that has had, just on our country here today, what economic impacts it's had, what social impacts it's had, the amount of fear that it caused, and really, in this example, that's only a disease that it has a lethality rate of about 3 to 3.5%. So if it was something that had a much higher, lethality rate attached to it, you can only, I think, you can take what the effects of COVID and just multiply it by times 10, and maybe that would get you into the sort of mindset of what you could experience going through something like that. Hopefully, of course, we never have to know what that is like. But it also, I think, is important and is useful to realize what things must have been like for people in the past. And it's important because it really tells you what a huge impact these diseases had, particularly on the contact era, particularly on that time period when Europeans were first coming over and meeting and interacting with American Indian groups. Because quite often these diseases would spread much faster than Europeans would. So when Europeans started coming across populations in the Americas, except for those very sort of first few that they encountered, quite often they were coming into contact with groups that had already had massive population losses, massive disruptions to their political, economic, and social systems due to these diseases. And really, all of the colonization in the Americas is predicated on the impact of these diseases. It's incredibly hard to imagine that Europeans would have been nearly as successful in their colonization efforts had there been 90% more people, still living and still being formed into strong communal and governmental and social systems. Quite often, when the European peoples encountered what they would consider, American Indian tribes or political units, these were confederacies that were made up of the survivors, of the 10% of the people who hadn't been killed and wiped out, who were just recovering from this incredibly, horrific chain of events that they had just experienced, which certainly would put them at a disadvantage in their interactions with European Americans, or Europeans, and eventually Euro-Americans as time is going to go on. And a good example of how this impact would look, maybe if that hadn't happened, is actually Africa. Europeans don't successfully colonize Africa really until the 1800s, with the invention of sort of industrialized weapons and medicines and so forth to help them sort of combat malaria. And it's not because Europeans didn't want to colonize Africa. They certainly would have and did prior to that time period. But the fact was they couldn't. There were large kingdoms and established cultural groups and plenty of people saying, well, no, you're not just going to walk in here and take our stuff. Same thing would have happened in the Americas had these diseases not gone through and wiped out such a huge percentage of the population. So I think the Columbian Exchange in general, you can certainly see, is a really good example of how you can't just look at something in history and say, well, this thing is good or this thing is bad. Certainly the Columbian Exchange has an incredibly impactful impact on the world. I mean, pretty much we wouldn't be sitting here today in the country we have, speaking the language that we do. The modern world would look nothing like it does today if this had not happened. That being said, that doesn't automatically mean that it's such a great thing. You have to be able to realize that just because something worked out well for some people, it also could work out very, very bad and poorly for other people. So rather than history being thing good or thing bad, it's really thing complex. And really, a lot of these issues that we're going to be going through this semester, we're going to want to take a look at it from multiple different angles to see, well, who benefited from this, maybe who didn't benefit from it, and what sort of impacts did that have. All right, moving on to our document exercise then. Looking at question number 1 here, how does Bartolomeo de las Casas depict American Indians? And what evidence does he present to argue his case about whether or not they should be considered civilized? I thought the class did a great job of bringing in direct quotes to help answer this question. That pretty early on in the document, De las Casas really lays out that the American Indians that he was interacting with had established laws, economies, trade, city, culture, pretty much all the hallmarks that he would consider civilization. And almost he's saying if you want to create a checklist of what civilization is, the American Indians are going to check off all of those boxes. I think he even goes so far at one point in time as to say that the American Indians are in some ways superior to Europe, which certainly was not a message I was getting back from a lot of the recording and interpretations that were being heard in Europe. He's certainly making a strong argument early on here that American Indians should certainly be considered civilized, and that that's going to try to sort of invalidate using that old sort of Aristotle logic of people who are uncivilized being legitimate to enslave them. Going on to question number 2, in what ways does Bartolomeo de las Casas use European and Spanish history to make his argument? In this factor, he really starts using an example from Spanish history of when the peninsula of Spain was invaded by the Roman Empire to try to make his point, where essentially the Romans came in, conquered the Spanish peninsula in a similar way that he felt the Spanish were invading the land of the American Indians. So he certainly starts off by saying that, well, some of the American Indians are fighting back. Well, the Spanish were fighting back against the Romans. That's something that's still sort of glorified in Spanish history. So if the Spanish had the right to fight back against the Romans, why don't American Indians have the right to fight back against the Spanish? He also uses this idea that the Romans sort of viewed the Spanish in the same way that the Spanish are currently viewing American Indians. Sort of saying, at one point in time, we were sort of seen very similar to the American Indians. And then goes on to sort of make the point that if the Romans had treated the Spanish in the same way that they were treating the American Indians, where would Spanish civilization be today? Sort of with the implication that Spain would be much weaker and certainly would look nothing like it does today if the Romans had been sort of as tyrannical to the Spanish as the Spanish were currently being to the American Indians. So sort of a sneaky way to use sort of a point that was well known in Spanish history to argue for why what the Spanish were doing wasn't necessarily the correct path. Going on to question number 3, in what ways does Bartolomeo de las Casas' European bias show in this article, and what parts of his argument might have American Indians refuted? And a lot of people did a very good job picking up on this, that you can certainly see Bartolomeo de las Casas' bias when he starts talking about religion, right? I mean, he is a Catholic bishop himself. That's one of the sort of the main reasons why he is there. So while he's willing to sort of grant the American Indians laws and economies and cities and a large swath of things that he thinks are sort of pretty much on par or very recognizable in Europe and have value and merit, the one thing that he sort of is always coming back to is this idea that, well, they can be converted or they should be converted. Sort of saying and assuming that his religion of Christianity is in some way, shape, or form superior, and that is just, he doesn't even seem to give it much thought, like just sort of a bygone conclusion that, well, maybe we shouldn't be necessarily conquering them, but we should certainly still be converting them, and certainly that's going to be an opinion that a lot of the American Indians probably and certainly will, after this time period, be refuting, saying that their religious ideas are just as valid as those coming from Europe. So there's no good reason, if there's not a sword pointed at them and they're not being forced, to completely give up their worldview and their belief systems. He also seems very, I would say, resigned to the idea that there's going to be some sort of dominion by Spain. He's sort of not arguing that Spain shouldn't be there, that they shouldn't be conquering. He's more or less saying we shouldn't be enslaving them, that we can rule over them, but maybe we should be doing it in a less harmful manner. But he certainly is not saying that Spain doesn't deserve to be there at all and should sort of pull back and just give the land back to the American Indians, which of course a lot of the American Indians probably would have very much refuted as well, saying no, this is our land, we've been here for centuries, get the hell out. Looking at question number 4, what impact do you think this document had on the debate described in the opening paragraph? In the end, do you think more Spanish would be likely the side of Bartolomeo de las Casas or Juan Inés Sepúlveda? For the most part, people sort of thought that Sepúlveda, despite the great points that de las Casas made, Sepúlveda's side would still probably be the one that would come out on top, particularly because sort of as history shows that was more of the trend moving forward, and also because the Spanish would have seen it in their best interest to keep viewing the American Indians as a population to be conquered and enslaved. But it's not quite as simple of a story as that, although that point of view certainly does have merit, because there were some people back in Europe that de las Casas and other people who are reporting on the ill treatment of American Indians were receiving. One of those was Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who very shortly after this time period is going to be essentially controlling all of Spain through dynastic marriages and so forth. He's going to be controlling the Holy Roman Empire and a number of other locations within Europe, including Spain. And he actually sends out an order telling the conquistadors and the people running these encomiendas that they are no longer allowed to enslave American Indians. But this comes into sort of one of the problems that you occur to here with the what's going on in the Americas, and that's the fact that there was really no direct political control that King Charles had. And while he could issue this, there was nothing that was going to be making the Spanish in the Americas, who were profiting off of the enslavement of American Indians, there was nothing that was going to compel them to actually follow this rule or this order. So for the most part, a lot of them just ignored it. When you really start seeing some movement on this is when the Spanish start encountering more pushback. For example, the Pueblo War, where certainly their kind of just bullying tactics blow up on them and ends up becoming much more costly. They realize that, hey, maybe if we're not so heavy-handed, we'll actually sort of get more profit out of our interactions than if we try to just come in as conquerors. And also, once there starts being more direct control by the Spanish government over these colonies and over these locations, you start seeing a change and shift in how the American Indian populations are going to be organized and treated and so forth. So once there is more of a say from Europe, you do start seeing a shift and a change. And it's hard to tell exactly how much arguments such as de las Casas is factored into that. But I would say it certainly probably wasn't completely overlooked or ignored, as it seemed to did have an impact on some, at least within Europe.